Welcome to the Crop Insurance Podcast, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of crop insurance. I'm your host, Mike Rydell, a third-generation crop insurance agent, and I'm thrilled to have you join me on this educational journey. At our family-owned and operated business, we've been providing crop insurance expertise for generations. Our goal here is simple, to educate our listeners. Crop insurance can be complex and overwhelming, but I believe that understanding it is crucial for every farmer. So whether you're a seasoned farmer looking to stay updated or a newcomer seeking guidance, this podcast is for you. Welcome to today's podcast, brought to you by Crop West Insurance Incorporated, your agent-friendly crop insurance group. Attention crop insurance agents, ready to revolutionize your business? Crop West Insurance is here to help. Their experienced team based in Spokane, Washington, offers tailored marketing plans, expert consultations, and exclusive training sessions to help you succeed. With access to industry-leading resources and a network of like-minded professionals, joining Crop West Insurance means unlocking the potential for increased revenue and unparalleled expertise. Do not miss out on this opportunity to thrive in the crop insurance marketplace. For more information, please head on over to their website at cropwestinsurance.com. Crop West Insurance Incorporated is an equal opportunity provider and employer. Welcome to the Crop Insurance Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Rydell. Today we're going to be discussing whole farm revenue protection and how it's safeguarding your farm's future. Today's episode, we're going to dive into the comprehensive risk management solution that is revolutionizing the way farmers protect their livelihoods. Stay tuned as we uncover how whole farm revenue protection provides a safety net for all commodities on the farm under one insurance policy. It's specifically tailored for diverse farming operations. So let's explore how whole farm revenue protection can be a game changer for your business. Before we jump into it, just a friendly reminder to check out our website at thecropinsurancepodcast.com, where you'll find an article that goes along with this podcast with some good visual aids and some handouts that you can download to help further your understanding of whole farm revenue protection. To get things started, let's take a listen as to what RMA defines whole farm revenue protection as, with a little help from our crop insurance podcast, AI.
Whole farm revenue protection provides a risk management safety net for all commodities on the farm under one insurance policy. This insurance plan is tailored for any farm with up to $17 million in insured revenue, including farms with specialty or organic commodities, both crops and livestock, or those marketing to local, regional, farm identity preserved, specialty, or direct markets.
It's not that this program is more complex than revenue protection or yield protection or the various topics we've discussed in earlier podcast episodes. It's just that this program is all by itself. It's separate from your traditional crop insurance, so there's lots of concepts to try to wrap your head around when first learning about it. So just imagine you're on a path and you're starting with not knowing what whole farm revenue protection is. And at the end of the path or the end of the road is a full understanding of how this can be a great program to help mitigate your risk. Along the way, there's going to be forks in the road and little gotchas or policy language that have certain specifications that you have to meet in order to qualify. Don't get frustrated by those. They're just there to help you get down the path as efficiently as possible. So today we're going to discuss the what, who, when, and how of whole farm revenue protection from a very high level. In part 2 of this whole farm revenue protection series, we're going to start to dive into the various paths this program can take, or the forks in the road, the what if this, what if that happens, those type of scenarios. Like I mentioned, there are several forks in the road, so hang in there and feel free to pause the episode at any time, go to our website, and keep an open mind as we learn about this awesome program. So first things first, what is it? What is whole farm revenue protection? Well, whole farm revenue protection, it offers a comprehensive risk management strategy for every commodity cultivated on the farm. It's all in one single policy. You're able to combine all the qualified revenue from your farm coupled with a coverage level of your choosing to determine your overall revenue guarantee for that year. Much like your traditional crop insurance policies, the premium is subsidized by the federal government. Please keep in mind there's a ton of asterisks in that description. However, we have to start somewhere, so that's a very high level view of what whole farm revenue is. Who can buy whole farm revenue protection? Well, in order to be able to buy it, you have to be eligible to receive federal benefits. You have to file a Schedule F tax form or be able to fill out a substitute Schedule F tax form, usually filled out by your accountant or a tax professional. You have to be engaged in farming and derive revenue from the production of commodities. You cannot derive any income from controlled substances. You cannot derive more than 50% of allowable revenue from commodities purchased for resale. You must file a U.S. federal tax return for each year of the revenue history that is the same tax entity and farm operation as the insured person for the previous 5 years. There are some exceptions to this rule, which we'll go over in part 2 as well. When can you purchase whole farm revenue protection, or when can you sign up for it? Like the rest of the federal crop insurance programs, whole farm revenue protection has a sales closing deadline that you need to comply with. Depending on what type of filer you are with your taxes and your county actuarials, that will determine what your sales closing deadline is. So you need to check with your crop insurance agent or check with the county actuarials to figure out which deadline applies to you. Now, when it comes to the types of filers that there are 3 types of filers as defined in the whole farm revenue protection policy. There's a calendar year filer, an early fiscal year filer, and a late fiscal year filer. For more on what those mean, let's listen to our crop insurance podcast, AI.
Calendar year filer, an insured that files tax based on the 12 consecutive months corresponding to January 1st through December 31st. Early fiscal year filer, an insured, other than a calendar year filer, that files taxes with a fiscal year that begins prior to September 1. Late fiscal year filer, an insured that files taxes with a fiscal year that begins September 1 or later.
Again, based on which type of filer you are, you'll want to check your county actuarials as to the sales closing deadline that's appropriate for you. Now we kind of know what it is, who can buy it, and when you can buy it. Well, how does it all work? Let's assume that you have 5 years of Schedule Fs for your operation or a Schedule F substitute. When we go to take your average of your Schedule Fs, we're not going to use the most recent tax year that immediately precedes the current insurance period, as that's known as the lag year. So we're going to skip the previous year and then use the 4 years prior to that to help come up with your historical average. This historical average of your Schedule Fs is known as your approved revenue. Before we continue on what you're going to do with that approved revenue figure, just know that there are several forks in the road here, and we will get into those paths on part 2 of our whole farm revenue protection series. For now, just know that we have our approved revenue figure, which we're going to use in the next step in the process. Now that you've taken that 4-year average to come up with your approved revenue, you're going to need to elect a coverage level. Depending on how many qualifying commodities you have, you can choose from 50% on up to 85% coverage level in 5% increments. In order to get the 80 or 85% coverage level, you're going to need a minimum of 3 qualifying commodities. Now again, this is another fork in the road that leads down another path. In part 2 of our whole farm revenue protection series, we will go over what the definition of a qualifying commodity is to help you determine how many qualifying commodities you have on your whole farm revenue protection policy. Now that you know what your approved revenue is and you've selected your appropriate coverage level, you're going to multiply those 2 figures to determine what your insured revenue is. Under the whole farm revenue protection policy, the maximum allowable insured revenue is $17 million. Now, Now remember, insured revenue is approved revenue times coverage level. So in theory, you could have $34 million in revenue and sign up for the 50% coverage level, because the insured revenue in that scenario would be $34 million times 50%, and that would then be under or at that $17 million cap. When people hear about the cap of $17 million for the insured revenue limitations under whole farm revenue protection, they start to think that this is only for very large operations. That is not the case. This whole farm revenue protection is for operations of all size. In fact, they have a specialty product known as micro farm that's very similar to whole farm revenue protection for operations whose revenue is under $350,000. Now, micro farm is a standalone product, and we will discuss it in another episode further down the road. Just know that it's there, and so that this program is for operations of all sizes. Now that we have your insured revenue, the next step is the policy is going to use the lesser of your insured revenue, which again, your approved revenue times coverage level. It's going to use the lesser of that number or your expected revenue. Your expected revenue is determined by filling out several forms with your crop insurance agent throughout the policy year to help determine the potential value of what you're farming for that current crop year. Expected revenue can get somewhat cumbersome or complicated as you dive a little deeper into that topic. And so we'll discuss this in more detail in the next episode, or part 2 of the whole farm revenue protection series. But you do need to know that the policy is going to use the lesser of your insured revenue or your expected revenue in helping to determine what your guarantee will be for your whole farm revenue protection policy. Now that we know your whole farm revenue protection policy's guarantee is the lesser of your insured revenue or your expected revenue, we can use this number when comparing it to our actual revenue to determine if there is a loss. When it comes to determining your actual revenue under the whole farm revenue protection policy, it can be as simple as filing your taxes and using that Schedule F. However, there are many forks in the road when determining your actual revenue that we will get into in part 2 of our whole farm revenue protection series. All things being equal, if you've correctly come up with your whole farm revenue protection guarantee, you've correctly come up with your actual revenue for the same crop year, when you compare those two figures, if your actual revenue is less than your whole farm revenue protection guarantee, you would have a loss in that scenario. As I just mentioned, there are forks in the road when it comes to figuring out if you have a loss or not. But one of the main ones I want to leave you with or discuss before we end this episode is understanding how your other FCIC or your other federal crop insurance policies work in conjunction with your whole farm revenue protection policy. By default, when you sign up for a whole farm revenue protection policy, any of your other FCIC policies are considered primary. Now, the two main things that this accomplishes is that number one, as a result of having your FCIC policies considered as primary, you have a reduced rate on your whole farm revenue protection policy, which can be a substantial reduction in rate. Number two, any indemnities or loss payments from your FCIC policies will be considered as revenue to count when calculating your actual revenue at the end of the policy year. The reason you need to pay attention to this is that anytime you have revenue to count, that would in theory reduce any whole farm revenue protection losses. One of the nice things about whole farm revenue protection is they give you the option to keep the standard or the default of having your FCIC policies considered primary, or you can elect to exclude them from being primary. In excluding them from being primary, you accomplish two things. The first thing you accomplish, which may be unwanted, is that your whole farm revenue protection premium will increase as a result of excluding your FCIC policies as considered as being primary. and depending on your situation, this increase in premium could be substantial. The second thing you accomplish, though, is that any indemnities from your FCIC policies would not be considered as revenue to count when factoring your actual revenue at the end of the insurance period for your whole farm revenue protection loss scenarios. It should be noted that depending on how much your loss is on your FCIC policies, while you might not take it as revenue to count from $1, if you cross over your deductible, which is the gap between your coverage level and 100% of your actual revenue, if you exceed that dollar amount, you will have to start taking some of that as revenue. And this is something we'll go into in a little bit more detail in part 2 of our whole farm revenue protection series. For now, it's important to know that your underlying FCIC policies can affect your whole farm revenue protection policy in terms of premium and or loss scenarios. Now, I know that we may have left you with more questions than answers in this part 1 episode of our whole farm revenue protection series, but I really just wanted to introduce you to the topic to get you thinking about it. In part 2, we're going to go back and look at some of these forks in the road that we mentioned and explore those paths just a little bit further so you can have a better understanding of how whole farm revenue protection can help your operation. From my family to yours, thank you very much for listening. I sincerely hope that this presentation has been instrumental in enhancing your understanding of federal crop insurance. If you find value in our podcast, we kindly encourage you to subscribe and spread the word among your friends and neighbors. To access further information, please visit our website at thecropinsurancepodcast.com, where you'll find the latest podcast episodes, articles, and exciting new features conveniently located in one place. This information is not all-inclusive and is meant to be used only as general guidelines for educational purposes. For additional information, please see crop provisions, reference the Crop Insurance Handbook or Loss Adjustment Manual, or contact your crop insurance agent. This institution is an equal opportunity provider and employer.